Every year, 5 million American homes are required to carry flood insurance, not because of flooding on their street, but because a line drawn on a FEMA map says so. That single line decides whether your mortgage must include flood coverage, can bump your insurance premiums by thousands, and controls how easily you can sell your house. Most homeowners have no idea that their financial future can hinge on a decades-old, government-issued flood insurance rate map, one that's often out of date and sometimes doesn't match the real risks at all. If you want to understand how these invisible boundaries work and how they could shape your biggest investment, you're in the right place. If you want more videos uncovering hidden forces like this, hit like and subscribe. Let's pull back the curtain on how FEMA flood maps are actually made and why those lines matter more than you think. A single line on a flood map can turn a family's dream home into a financial gamble overnight. Here's how it works. If any part of your house touches what FEMA calls a special flood hazard area, usually labeled as Zone A or V on a flood insurance rate map, your lender is required by federal law to demand flood insurance. This isn't optional if you have a federally backed mortgage. It doesn't matter if you've never seen a drop of water on your street. The moment that line crosses your property, you're on the hook. For about 5 million homes across more than 22,000 U.S. communities, this means annual premiums that can add $1,000 or more to the cost of owning a home. Some policies run much higher, especially in coastal states or older neighborhoods where maps haven't kept up with new development or climate trends. That extra cost doesn't just hit your bank account each year. It can make your house harder to sell or even lower its value by tens of thousands of dollars if buyers know they'll be stuck with those premiums. I was surprised to learn how often buyers and sellers get blindsided at closing, discovering only then that a decades-old map has quietly changed the math on their biggest investment. Insurance companies and banks rely on these maps to set rates and approve loans. Local governments use them to decide where you can build or renovate. But for most homeowners, the real shock comes when a simple map update lands in the mailbox and suddenly changes everything. If you want deeper dives into the hidden rules that shape your financial life, don't forget to like and subscribe. Anyone can check their flood zone in minutes, and after seeing how much is riding on a single map line, it's worth doing right now. The official source is FEMA's Flood Map Service Center, found at msc.fema.gov. Here's how it works. First, enter your home address in the search bar at the top of the page. The system will pull up the relevant map panel for your area. Second, click View Map to open an interactive version. You'll see shaded regions, symbols, and a legend. Don't worry if it looks overwhelming. Third, look for your property on the map and note the flood zone label, like Zone AE, A, V, or X. If your lot touches a shaded special flood hazard area, you're in a zone where insurance is mandatory for federally backed mortgages. The panel will also show the base flood elevation, or BFE, which is the height floodwaters are expected to reach in a so-called 100-year flood, a term that actually means a 1% chance of flooding in any given year, not once per century. If you want a printable version, click Create Fermet to download a PDF excerpt for your records or to share with your lender or insurance agent. It's a good idea to check the map's effective date, too, since some communities are still using maps from decades ago. Knowing your zone is the first step to understanding your real risk, and to making sure you're not caught off guard when your lender or insurer comes calling. A modern flood map starts with a technology that sounds like science fiction: LiDAR. Instead of relying on old paper surveys or rough guesswork, FEMA now uses aircraft equipped with lasers that scan the ground, firing millions of pulses every second. Each pulse bounces back from the earth, buildings, or even tree branches, and the equipment records the exact time it takes to return. By combining all these returns, engineers build a digital elevation model with vertical accuracy down to just a few centimeters, about the thickness of a stack of quarters. This level of detail matters because even a slight change in elevation can mean the difference between a property being inside or outside a high-risk flood zone. Maya Chen, a hydrologist who's led several risk map projects, describes the process as a blend of high-tech measurement and old-fashioned detective work. After the LiDAR data is collected, it's processed to strip away trees and buildings, revealing the true shape of the land underneath. That bare earth model becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Next comes the modeling. Hydrologists feed the elevation data into specialized software, often HEC-HMS, for simulating rainfall and runoff, and HEC-RAS for mapping how water actually moves across the landscape. They layer in local rainfall records, soil types, and stream flow measurements, then run simulations of a so-called 1% annual chance flood. This is the event most people know as the 100-year flood, but the label is misleading. It doesn't mean you're safe for a century after a flood. It just means there is a 1 in 100 chance of that flood happening in any given year, a risk that adds up to about a 1 in 4 chance over the course of a standard 30-year mortgage. The result is the base flood elevation, or BFE, the predicted height floodwaters could reach during that 1% event. On a finished map, the BFE is shown as a line or number, sometimes just a few feet apart from where the risk zone ends. For some neighborhoods, that line can literally run through someone's living room. Every new map update means rerunning these calculations with the latest terrain and climate data, which is why new LiDAR flights and hydrologic models are so important. When you see a flood zone boundary or a BFE on a FEMA map, you're looking at the product of thousands of data points, advanced modeling, and months of technical review, far more precise than the broad brushstrokes of the 1970s maps still used in many places today. Surprising number of flood maps in use today still trace their origins to the era of disco and rotary phones. Roughly 30% of all FEMA panels, covering thousands of communities, are based on studies from before the year 2000. Many of these legacy maps were drawn using old topographic surveys and paper contour lines, with vertical errors that can reach plus or minus 1 foot. In practical terms, that is enough to put an entire first floor in or out of a flood zone, depending on which side of the error you land. As neighborhoods have grown, paved over, and weather patterns have shifted, these old lines have quietly shaped where insurance is required and how much people pay, often without reflecting today's real risks. Recognizing these gaps, Congress and FEMA launched the Risk Map program in 2009, a nationwide effort to bring flood mapping into the 21st century. More than $1 billion has been invested so far, funding new LiDAR flights, state-of-the-art modeling, and public outreach. The results are dramatic. Modern maps now achieve vertical accuracy within about 0.2 of a foot, a 5-fold improvement over the legacy standard. But progress is uneven. While some regions now benefit from these ultra-precise maps, others are still governed by decades-old boundaries, especially in rural or coastal areas where updates lag. For homeowners and local officials, FEMA provides tools to correct or challenge outdated designations. The Letter of Map Amendment, LOMA, lets property owners submit elevation data to prove their structure sits above the mapped flood level, potentially removing the mandatory insurance requirement. For broader changes, the Letter of Map Revision, or LOMR, allows communities or engineers to submit new studies that can update floodplain boundaries for entire neighborhoods. These amendment letters have become essential for navigating the gap between old maps and modern reality, especially as climate-driven events expose risks that legacy lines miss. The stakes of these gaps become painfully clear in places like Ellicott City, Maryland, where catastrophic floods struck neighborhoods that official maps had long considered safe. The story of how those old lines failed and how new tools are reshaping the map shows just how much hinges on getting these boundaries right. Tom Baker had run his outdoor gear shop on Main Street for more than a decade, never thinking much about the lines on a flood map. On the afternoon of July 30, 2016, a wall of water tore through Ellicott City, Maryland, turning the street outside his storefront into a raging river. Meteorologists measured nearly 6.5 inches of rain in just 3 hours, more than twice what the area's flood maps had planned for. By the time the water receded, Tom's shop was filled with 4 feet of mud and debris. He found his inventory ruined, display cases shattered, and the register wedged against a back wall. The damage to businesses and homes across the city would eventually total over $1.5 billion. What stunned Tom most wasn't just the speed or force of the flood, but the realization that his building sat well outside the official high-risk zone on FEMA's map. According to the base flood elevation line, supposedly the upper limit for a 1% annual chance flood, his property shouldn't have seen more than a few inches of water in the worst-case scenario. Instead, the water rose 4, even 5 feet above that line, submerging everything. For Tom and dozens of other business owners, the map's promise of safety had vanished in a single afternoon. The insurance payout process brought more frustration. Because his shop wasn't in a mapped special flood hazard area, flood insurance wasn't required, and Tom, like many others, hadn't bought it. Federal disaster aid covered only a fraction of his losses. Rebuilding meant draining savings, taking out loans, and hoping that next time the map would do a better job. But as Tom would learn, the map hadn't changed in years, even as new construction and paved surfaces upstream sent more runoff barreling toward downtown. The disaster left scars on Main Street, but also exposed a problem that maps alone couldn't fix. For Tom, the line on the map had been more than just a number. It was a promise that failed when it mattered most. 2 years after the first disaster, Ellicott City faced another blow. On May 27, 2018, nearly 28 inches of rain fell across the watershed in less than 3 hours, a deluge even more intense than the 2016 flood. This time, the damage stretched even further beyond the old flood zone lines. For residents and business owners, it was déjà vu with a cruel twist. The map's promise of safety had failed again, and the water was rising faster than ever before. After the second flood, engineers and hydrologists got to work with a new urgency. They launched a comprehensive runoff study using high-resolution LiDAR data and updated rainfall records. What the team found was stark. Runoff volumes had increased by at least 15% since the last official study, driven by upstream development and more frequent heavy rain events. The models showed that the so-called 100-year flood now looked more like a 25 or even 10-year event in practical terms. The base flood elevation, which sets the official flood risk for insurance and building codes, needed to jump by 2 feet in some parts of downtown. With these findings in hand, Howard County submitted a formal letter of map revision, or LOMR, to FEMA. The LOMR process allows communities to present new scientific evidence, like updated LiDAR, stormwater modeling, and high water marks, to revise the floodplain boundaries and base flood elevations on the official map. It is a rigorous process requiring months of data analysis, public comment, and federal review. In this case, the new map expanded the high-risk zone to cover dozens of properties that had previously been considered safe, and raised the BFE throughout Main Street by about 2 feet. FEMA approved the LOMR in 2020, making the changes official. For Tom Baker and his neighbors, the map now matched the reality they had experienced twice in 3 years. Insurance became mandatory for many, but the update also meant that future buyers, lenders, and planners would see a risk that had been invisible before. Tom Baker summed it up best. The map finally caught up to the water. The process did not erase the scars, but it did prove that flood maps are not set in stone. They can be revised when new evidence demands it. As climate change pushes storms to new extremes, this kind of data-driven correction is not just possible, but essential. Along the nation's coasts, the numbers are moving in only one direction. NOAA's latest projections show sea levels rising by 10 to 12 inches by 2050, about as much as the previous 100 years combined, but in just a single generation. For millions of homeowners, this isn't a distant worry. It's a measurable shift that could push today's safe ground into tomorrow's floodplain, redrawing the lines on thousands of flood insurance rate maps. Dr. Lena Rossi, a coastal geoscientist, has spent her career translating these projections into practical warnings. She points out that most FEMA flood maps still base their base flood elevation, the number that sets the official risk line, on historic data, not future sea levels. In many coastal towns, the BFE sits within 3 feet of high tide. At a foot of sea level rise, and the so-called 100-year flood becomes a lot more frequent. In some places, a storm that was once expected once per century could strike every decade or even every few years. NOAA's 2022 report didn't just predict higher tides. It warned that nuisance flooding, those sunny day floods that swamp streets and yards, will become a regular part of life for millions living near the ocean. Dr. Rossi's team runs climate pilot studies, layering projected sea level rise on top of FEMA's maps. The results are sobering. Neighborhoods that have never needed flood insurance before could find themselves inside the risk zone by the time a new map is drawn. For homeowners, lenders, and local officials, these numbers aren't abstract. They're the next reality check, coming sooner than most people think. Jenna Park, a flood risk analyst, has spent years comparing FEMA's official maps with independent models. She points to a problem hiding in plain sight. Millions of American homes are facing a level of flood risk that the maps simply don't show. According to the First Street Foundation, about 14.6 million properties nationwide are exposed to a 1% annual chance of flooding, nearly double the number FEMA's maps currently identify. That's not a small oversight. It means entire neighborhoods, sometimes whole towns, are left off the radar when it comes to insurance requirements and disaster planning. The issue isn't just about old maps. Even the latest FEMA panels often freeze the base flood elevation the height water is expected to reach in a so-called 100-year flood based on past events and outdated assumptions. Jenna explains that while the science behind mapping has advanced, the system for updating those maps hasn't kept pace. Some maps go a decade or more without a refresh, even as new development and heavier storms change the landscape. Groups like the Union of Concerned Scientists and First Street have pushed for reforms, urging Congress to fund regular nationwide map updates every 2 years, not every decade. One proposal calls for $500 million in annual grants to modernize flood risk data across all 50 states. Without this, Jenna warns, homeowners will keep making decisions based on lines that no longer reflect reality. As climate change accelerates, the gap between mapped and actual risk is only getting wider. For millions, the true danger isn't just the next storm, it's the quiet, invisible undercount that leaves them unprepared. FEMA's maps still define risk for over 22,000 communities. Yet independent studies estimate 14.6 million U.S. properties face greater flood danger than official maps show. As NOAA projects 10 to 12 inches of sea level rise by 2550, the line between safe and at risk grows blurrier. Understanding these maps isn't just policy, it's personal finance, climate reality, and your home's future. Want more deep dives into hidden systems? Like and subscribe for updates.